Donald Trump these days has been reminding me of another Donald. Do you remember Donald Sutherland back in 1978, Invasion of the Body Snatchers? Well, every time I hear Donald Trump open up his mouth in 2026, I think of that loud, piercing scream, the last noise that you hear from Donald Sutherland in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. In other words, Donald Trump is not his normal self. Back in his first term, he was the peace president. He was certainly someone who diverted from the policies of George W. Bush, of Joe Biden, of Barack Obama. But in his second term, he is the war president. It all reminds me of what I rather egotistically called in an earlier YouTube video, Flynn's first rule of politics. Can we call it maybe Flynn's only rule of politics? And that is that every Republican not committed to not being Dick Cheney becomes Dick Cheney. Alternatively, every Republican president not committed to not being George W. Bush becomes George W. Bush. As strange as it sounds, in his second term, Donald Trump has become George W. Bush. Let's talk about it. Just over a year ago, Donald Trump campaigned that he was going to stop wars. And here we are, 14 months into his second presidency. We've already had strikes against 7 different nations, to include the Christmas bombing on Nigeria, which is really kind of being the world policeman striking out at some bad guys. Includes Somalia, of course, Venezuela. That was probably the more successful operation in the sense that we had no real casualties, no deaths, but we got rid of a bad guy. A couple of different operations with regard to Iran. There's Iraq, there's Yemen. Did I mention Somalia? I don't know if I got all 7, but there's been quite a few. In fact, there's been as many military operations, many military strikes during Donald Trump's presidency on as many countries as any president has made in recent memory. Now, this is obviously a very different approach than Donald Trump took in his first term. It's not the guy who was campaigning for the Nobel Peace Prize. It's not the guy who said he was going to be the peace president. It's something very different. And we've seen these kind of massive shifts in politicians in the history of this country. And I think about, in my lifetime, George H.W. Bush rather famously said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And then, of course, 2 years later, in 1990, he signed a big tax bill. And the biggest one I can think of, I think the one that comes to mind for most people, is Woodrow Wilson. I mean, he campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And then the following year, with an assist from Germany, he brought us into war. And so presidents have harmed their place, not just amongst the voters, but in history by betraying their principles, essentially. Or someone might, their defenders might argue, well, if the situation sort of demanded that they not view principles as like the hobgoblin of little minds, that they shifted. Well, Donald Trump has shifted as well. There's a number of things that alarm me about the shift. And what I want to talk about is not so much whether going into Iran was the right thing or the wrong thing to do. I mean, history is going to vindicate that or not. The first contradiction that comes to mind is with regard to regime change, with regard to nation building. He famously said, this is 2016, "We must abandon the failed policy of nation building and regime change." Now he insists that he be involved in selecting the next leader of Iran. And he said the other day that it would be unacceptable if the son of the Ayatollah, I believe you pronounce it Khamenei, if his son, if this 86-year-old guy that we killed son, becomes the next supreme leader. That would be unacceptable. Well, what did Iran do? Well, they made that kid, he's not really a kid anymore, but they made that guy's son the new leader. The idea that you're telling a foreign country that you're going to dictate who is going to be president. Now, I don't know that it's any better in Iran. They have some group called the Council of Experts. I don't know if the Council of Experts can pick Iran's president any more legitimately than can Donald Trump, but I would think there would be an option C or an option D. We maybe let the people of Iran pick eventually. Another thing that bothers me is Trump said this is going to be a 4 to 5 week war. I don't think so. And the reason I don't think so is there have been several contradictory things that have come out of Trump's mouth, including the idea that he's not ruling out boots on the ground. Now, that may just be smart strategically. You want to keep the enemy guessing. And there may be a reason for the objective of the mission to send in special forces and to get this enriched uranium. I don't know. But if you're seriously considering a ground war in that part of Asia, I think they said something about that in The Princess Bride, right? And maybe Trump didn't see The Princess Bride, I don't know. But history gives all sorts of warnings about that kind of a land war, and I hope he's not seriously considering that. But if you say you want unconditional surrender, leave aside the ground troops. If you say you want unconditional surrender from these people, I think what that tells you is that it's not going to last 4 to 5 weeks. People that refer to us routinely as the Great Satan, they're not going to be very keen on surrendering to us unconditionally. I think there's going to be a few conditions. Iran is really giving off Hiroshi Onoda vibes. Remember that guy who, hung out for a quarter century or so, actually almost 30 years after the end of the Second World War, fighting it on some island in the Philippines, Japanese soldier. He reminds me of some of these people who run Iran. So does the Black Knight. Remember him from Monty Python's The Holy Grail? And you cut off one of his arms. He says, it's his but a flesh wound. And then you cut off all of his limbs, and he says, let's call it a draw. Maybe you can debate whether unconditional surrender is the right thing or the wrong thing. I happen to think that, too many people looked at war through the prism of two different wars because we're very simplistic in the United States. We look through it, I'm sure the Democrats are looking through the prism of Vietnam, and they're saying, oh no, this is going to be a quagmire, this is going to be terrible. And the Republicans are looking at it through the prism of World War II. And in the prism of World War II, we are the 100% heroes, and the enemy is completely villainous. And so we need to have unconditional surrender. There's an article by Ryan McMakin at Mises Wire about how unconditional surrender tends to prolong wars. And I completely agree with that. I mean, it just makes if you use common sense, you don't even have to have any knowledge of history. But if you go to a country and say, submit to us completely or we're going to keep fighting you, well, they're probably going to be more apt to want to keep fighting you. Not too many people are such cowards that they want to submit to anyone completely. And I think Iran, a country that views us as the Great Satan, they're certainly not going to want to submit to us. They may have to, but they're not going to want to do that. And so the whole idea of saying it's going to last 4 to 5 weeks in one sentence, and then another sentence saying, well, they're going to have to surrender to us unconditionally, those two things don't go together. Let's face reality. Those two things don't go together. Now, what I worry about ground troops is a cascading effect. They become immediately terrorist magnets. Remember when at the beginning of the video I was sitting by a waterfall? Well, that cascade, that's what happens when you put troops on the ground. Particularly, don't have a land war in Asia. I don't know who, someone said that famously in a movie. Well, that you have a cascading effect because the moment one of those guys get killed, well, we're going to be out for vengeance. We're going to put in more ground troops, and more of those guys are going to get killed. It plays into what the Iranians want. They don't want warfare where it's simply in the air because they lose that war. But once it gets on the ground and in the mountains of Iran, well, they could do pretty well and they could inflict some damage on us. Unfortunately, we found that out in Afghanistan when we fought there rather heavily. I think Iran, if we do put troops on the ground in a traditional land war sense, that's a fool's errand. Another thing that bothers me is with regard to congressional authorization. I have to confess, this bothers me more about Congress than it does about President Trump. President Trump's basically doing what most presidents have done since World War II. I looked it up today, or I saw it in an article, that the last time that the United States declared war was in 1942, and we declared war against Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary. So in the 84 years since, we fought a number of wars, but Congress just doesn't declare them anymore. A lot of presidents have enough deference to the Constitution to ask for a war authorization. George W. Bush got that before Iraq. But these days, congressmen don't even want to do that because they don't like having the responsibility. When I was a political science student more than 30 years ago, there was a guy that I came across, or a political scientist that I read. His name was David Mayhew. And he said that congressmen are single-minded seekers of re-election. Nothing in the 30 years since has disabused me of that notion. Nothing has even challenged it. And if you look at history, you think of all of the responsibilities that Congress has, they tend to give them away. I mean, the Federal Reserve now is the one who coins money. The Supreme Court legislates from the bench without much of a objection from Congress. And of course, presidents have taken on war powers that the Constitution forbade from them. And if you think about, the other day, Thomas Massey, when they made a feeble attempt to wrest the war powers back to the Congress, Thomas Massey gave a speech in which he quoted James Madison writing a letter to Thomas Jefferson. And in that letter, Madison said that, when they were setting up the constitutional system, everyone knew that there were dangers in vesting the war power in the executive, because that's the branch of government that's more apt to just go off and commit the country to war. They vested that power in the Congress for a reason. And he's writing to Thomas Jefferson in 1798. They're complaining about John Adams. And my point to anyone who sort of doubts where the war powers lie, do you know more about the Constitution than James Madison? Does Trump know more about the Constitution than James Madison? This is the guy that's called the father of the Constitution. He's the guy that wrote a lot of the Constitution. And here he is in black and white, in ink, on parchment, saying we put the war powers in with Congress and not with the president. You don't even have to read this letter. Just read the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8. Now, if you go back a month or so, I think there was some foreshadowing to this moment in time that we're at war with Iran. And that was when you had an attempt to rein in the president's war powers by members of Congress, and this included several Republican senators. They took a vote, and in the initial vote, there were 5 Republican senators. Of course, Rand Paul of Kentucky. There was also Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. There was also Senator Young of Indiana, and most surprisingly, Josh Hawley, who's kind of a real partisan of the president's. They all voted to basically restrict the president's war-making ability in Venezuela to 2 months. And that was a preliminary vote. And then the president came out and said, all of these people, and he named them all, these Republicans, none of them deserve to ever get a vote from any Republican. None of them deserve to get elected again. That's essentially what he said. It seemed, even by the president's standards, rather harsh. Particularly with Hawley. He is someone that doesn't normally buck the president's position. He is MAGA to the core. But the president came out even against him. Well, Hawley bucked on that, and several of the others did too, and the president got his way. But you look back on that and you say, well, did the president in his mind's eye have something more ambitious than Venezuela? In other words, did he have this Iran adventure in mind? Did he think we're going to go invade Iran because he wanted to put them on notice? Don't check me. I have this power and I'm not going to give it up. What it is a lot like Lord of the Rings. Undoubtedly, we have the most powerful military in the world. I know this firsthand. I was part of the military for 8 years. We're pretty powerful. You get an M1A1, if you get an M1 Abrams tank, you know the kind of power that we have. And I've sat in one of those before, and I've sat in smaller vehicles, and I know that, we have a powerful military. The temptation, the seduction for most presidents is to use that power. They want to do some good. And I think for Donald Trump, what's happened is that domestically, he's looking at kind of a stalemate Joe Biden-ish presidency. Because even though he owns the Republicans own both houses of Congress, they do so by narrow margins. The Democrats are obstructionists. So there's very little Donald Trump can get accomplished domestically without the use of executive order and means other than legislation. I think he got frustrated and he thought, I can do something outside of our nation's borders. I can really make an impact. I wonder if concern about his legacy and also concern about him being kind of a Joe Biden-ish stalemate president is something that's playing into his sudden change of heart with regard to foreign policy. The last part that really concerns me is there was a mission accomplished vibe. If you saw this tweet a few days ago, the British said carriers to that region, after all. And Trump's response was, he says, we don't need people that join wars after we've already won. Imagine that. He's not fighting the war. I'm sure the people fighting the war think the more the merrier. We could use people. Franklin Roosevelt in the Second World War, he joined, cheek by jowl with Joseph Stalin. Stalin was a guy that was allies with Hitler for something, like 21 months of the war, from the Hitler-Stalin Pact in, I don't know, June of 39, and then it ends with in September of 39, the Hitler-Stalin Pact starts. They invade Poland. Both of them carve it up. And then in June of 1941, Operation Barbarossa launches, and it's sort of a no honor amongst thieves pact. And Stalin probably regrets ever joining up with Hitler. Well, if we could join up with a guy like that to win a war, why can't the president join up with the Brits? I mean, they in the moral spectrum, I think the Brits are somewhere in a far better position than were the Soviets in 1941. And yet Trump has this sort of mission accomplished vibe. You notice that he said, a war we've already won. I don't know that we've won that war. A couple of years ago, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, I think, a rather sensible idea. He said that these globalists want to squander all of America's strength, blood, and treasure chasing monsters and phantoms. For a lot of us, myself included, that's why we voted for this guy, or it's one of the reasons why we voted for him. Kind of like immigration, it was one of the animating principles behind MAGA. And now a lot of Trump's votaries are telling us that, well, MAGA meant something else all along. Not everyone's buying it. I mean, people like Tucker Carlson and Rand Paul and Thomas Massie and Marjorie Taylor Greene and all sorts of people are standing up to the president. But my sense is that amongst the MAGA devotees, there's not going to be much change in the president's support. The left often reminds us that Trump has a ceiling. Maybe his ceiling's 52%, 53%, I don't know. But there's a ceiling at which he hits that ceiling and he can't get any more support than that. Some people are just committed to being against Donald Trump. We know that. But he also has a floor. That's what they don't like to point out. And that floor has gotten strengthened. There's a lot of joists under that floor now. And those joists came from the Russia collusion hoax. They came from the fact that leftists in various cities and in the federal government were threatening Trump with 717 and a half years in jail for various non-crimes that they had, for the most part, just made up. And the joists strengthened because of what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania. But the longer this war lasts, the more tenuous that support becomes. The more casualties we take, the more tenuous the support becomes. And the higher the gas prices go. They've already gone up at the time of this video, 50 cents per gallon. It's sad to say, but people do support policy and war based on things like pocketbook issues like gas prices. That affects everyone. If things start to look better in Iran, if it looks like there are reasonable people that are going to take the reins of power, and all this oppression from the regime, I mean, they killed something like 30,000 people in the lead up to this war, people who were protesters. The Shah, I think, killed hundreds and hundreds of people, at least from the contemporaneous news accounts. Yet these people in the protests in 2025 and 2026, they killed tens of thousands of people, of their own people. They're brutal people. And so if they get replaced, if Trump is able to replace these people with anything resembling something that we can deal with, I think this mission will go down in history as a great success. I'm not, I have a lot of prayers and hopes that it is successful. I don't have a lot of confidence at this point, and maybe things will change. I don't know. I have it more in my memory than on a piece of paper. There was a famous speech that John Quincy Adams gave to the Congress in 1821 when he was Secretary of State. And he said something along the lines that America is always the well-wisher of freedom and independence for other peoples. But we go abroad not in search of monsters to destroy. In other words, we will pray for you, we will wish you well if you're looking to get your own freedom, but it's not our job to go around the world in search of monsters to destroy. And I think up until very recently, most of the people who voted for Donald Trump, Republicans who were dejected with the George W. Bush, Romney, McCain foreign policy, which was about nation building, it was about going about toppling bad guys, and that, as Trump said, that squandered our blood and treasure and was bankrupting this country and was killing a lot of guys. People were sick of that, and they look. The whole reason why Donald Trump won in 2016 is because of that and other issues. He was able to say, I am not like these guys. I'm not like McCain. I'm not like George W. Bush. I'm a different kind of Republican. I'm my own man. And all of a sudden, all these years later, that John Quincy Adams quote, which was kind of an animating feature of his foreign policy, we find out, oh no, that was not the animating feature all along. And it's like an M. Night Shyamalan movie, or like a movie from 1978, the second installment of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. This is the second installment of Donald Trump's presidency. This is the second term, and in that second installment of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you heard that shriek from Donald Sutherland at the end of the movie. Unfortunately, that's what a lot of people, a lot of supporters of Donald Trump are hearing from him when he talks these days. In the movie, it was really scary. In real life, it's sad.